The story of the Kingdom of Israel begins long before there was a king, a capital, or even a country. It begins in a time when people moved with their herds, followed seasonal rains, and lived in scattered family groups across the highlands of ancient Canaan. The Israelites did not appear suddenly on the stage of history. Their identity emerged gradually, shaped by migration, interaction, and memory. According to the Hebrew Bible, the origins of Israel begin with a man named Abraham. He is said to have come from a place called Ur in Mesopotamia and to have journeyed to the land of Canaan at the command of his God. Whether Abraham was a historical figure or a symbol of early ancestral memory, the traditions surrounding him reveal something important. The Israelites saw themselves as outsiders who became natives. Their identity was rooted in movement, migration, and a promise tied to the land. Archaeologists generally agree that around the late 2nd millennium BCE, the central highlands of Canaan, roughly today's West Bank region, saw the rise of small, self-sufficient hilltop villages. These settlements were modest. Houses were made of stone. There were no palaces or temples. Pottery styles were plain, but their appearance marked a shift. Unlike the earlier urban centers of Canaanite cities in the valleys, these highland settlements showed signs of a new social pattern, one less connected to the powerful city-states and foreign empires of the time. This shift likely began around the 13th century BCE. That was a time of turmoil in the ancient Near East. Great powers such as Egypt, the Hittite Empire, and Mycenaean Greece were all beginning to decline. The collapse of these large systems opened space for smaller groups to emerge. In Canaan, many lowland cities were destroyed or abandoned. At the same time, population in the highlands began to grow. These changes suggest that groups were moving away from urban centers, either fleeing conflict, seeking new land, or breaking off from old political structures. In these highlands, early Israelites began to form. They did not yet call themselves a kingdom. There were no kings, no written laws, no organized religion as we think of it today. But over time, they began to share certain practices. For example, archaeologists have noted the near-total absence of pig bones in highland sites associated with these people. This sets them apart from neighboring Canaanites and Philistines, and may reflect early dietary laws later codified in the Torah. Simple altars and stone pillars suggest early forms of worship that later evolved into the Yahwistic religion of Israel. Inscriptions from Egypt help shed outside light on this new group. A key piece of evidence comes from the reign of Pharaoh Merneptah, who ruled in the late 13th century BCE. In one of his victory steles, a stone monument celebrating a military campaign, he lists a people called Israel among those defeated in Canaan. The line reads, "Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more." This is the earliest known mention of Israel outside the Bible, and it dates to around 1200 BCE. Importantly, the inscription refers to Israel not as a kingdom or city, but as a people, using a determinative symbol in Egyptian that denotes a social group rather than a geographic place. This supports the idea that early Israel was a tribal or ethnic identity, not yet a centralized state. It existed alongside, and often in tension with, older Canaanite groups, Philistine migrants on the coast, and Egyptian garrisons that still controlled parts of the region. The Israelites' roots were intertwined with Canaanite culture. Their language was a dialect of Canaanite. Their pottery styles, architecture, and agricultural practices all developed locally. Rather than invading Canaan from outside, as some older biblical interpretations suggested, most modern scholars believe the Israelites emerged from within Canaanite society. Some may have been runaway peasants, displaced workers, or dissident groups who moved into the hills and formed new communities with new values. This idea is supported by the work of scholars like Israel Finkelstein and William Dever, who argue for a model of gradual emergence. Instead of a single conquest or exodus, the identity of Israel was forged over time, shaped by environmental pressures, political changes, and evolving beliefs. The early Israelites were likely a mix of former Canaanites, tribal pastoralists, and refugees from the instability of the lowlands. Yet identity is not only about origin, it is also about memory. The biblical stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph served as powerful narratives that bound the people together. These patriarchal stories emphasized family, journey, and divine promise. Whether these figures were historical or legendary, they provided a shared framework through which later generations understood their past and place in the world. One key moment in these traditions is the story of Jacob, who receives the name Israel after wrestling with a divine being. From him, 12 sons are said to have become the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. These symbolic origins reinforced the idea of unity among diverse clans, even if historical tribal relations were often tense or competitive. The Exodus stands as one of the most enduring and influential narratives in the history of the ancient Israelites. More than just a story of liberation, it provided a moral foundation, a national memory, and a theological charter that shaped Israelite identity for centuries. Whether viewed through the lens of faith, tradition, or historical analysis, the Exodus narrative represents a defining moment in the formation of a people who saw themselves as chosen, redeemed, and bound by covenant. According to the Hebrew Bible, the Exodus begins with the Israelites in Egypt, where they are said to have lived for generations. Over time, their status changes from that of welcomed guests to that of an enslaved people under Egyptian oppression. The book of Exodus describes how a new Pharaoh, who knew not Joseph, feared the growing numbers of Israelites and subjected them to forced labor. This theme of oppression and deliverance became central to Israelite identity. They were a people rescued from bondage not by human revolt, but by divine intervention. Historically, however, the Exodus presents a complex challenge. There is no direct Egyptian record confirming a mass departure of Hebrew slaves, and Egyptian records from the New Kingdom period, particularly the 19th and 20th dynasties, are extensive. Yet, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Many scholars suggest that if an Exodus-like event occurred, it may have involved a smaller group whose memory was later elevated to national significance. The story, even if not fully historical in the way modern readers expect, captures the self-understanding of a people shaped by hardship and rescue. If there was a historical kernel behind the Exodus, it may have taken place during the Late Bronze Age, perhaps during the 13th or early 14th century BCE, 12th century BCE, a period marked by regional upheaval. Some scholars point to the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses II, who ruled in the 13th century BCE, as a potential setting, given that the city of Pi-Ramesses, mentioned in the biblical account, was a major construction project of that era. Others propose a later setting, during the time of Ramesses III, or during the general collapse of Egyptian control in Canaan. The name Moses itself is Egyptian in origin, meaning born of, as seen in names like Thutmose and Amos. This detail suggests a cultural connection between the biblical figure and Egypt, supporting the idea that at least part of the Israelite leadership may have had ties to the Nile Valley. Moses, according to tradition, was raised in the Egyptian court but fled after killing an overseer. He later encountered God in the form of a burning bush and was commanded to return to Egypt to free his people. The confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh becomes a central drama in the book of Exodus. It culminates in a series of plagues, each targeting aspects of Egyptian life and religion. The final plague, the death of the firstborn, leads Pharaoh to release the Israelites. But shortly afterward, he pursues them, and the Israelites are said to have crossed the Red Sea while the Egyptian army perished. Again, whether these events happened in precisely the way described is not the main point from a historical perspective. What matters is how the story functioned for the Israelites. The Exodus narrative became their origin story, one that framed their God as a liberator who acted on behalf of the oppressed. It was a theological revolution in a world where gods were usually aligned with the powerful. After their escape, the Israelites are said to have journeyed into the Sinai wilderness, where they received the covenant at Mount Sinai. This event introduced a new kind of social and moral order. Unlike the law codes of Mesopotamia or Egypt, which often focused on protecting royal authority or property, the Mosaic covenant emphasized communal ethics and divine accountability. The central feature of this covenant was the 10 Commandments. These laws, inscribed on stone tablets, established core principles: loyalty to one God, respect for parents, prohibitions against murder, theft, false witness, and adultery. They formed the foundation of Israelite religious and social life, and were unique in that they were seen as binding not just on kings or elites, but on all members of the community. The Sinai experience also introduced the concept of a mobile sanctuary, the tabernacle, where the divine presence could dwell among the people. This idea of God traveling with his people reinforced their identity as a community in motion, united not by territory, but by shared law and faith. The priestly class, descended from Aaron, Moses' brother, played a key role in maintaining ritual purity and sacrificial practices. The wilderness period, traditionally said to last 40 years, became a symbol of both divine testing and divine provision. While scholars debate the historicity of the duration and details, the narrative served to explain how a group of slaves became a disciplined people. Manna from heaven, water from rocks, and victories over enemies like the Amalekites all reinforced the theme of dependence on God and the development of communal trust. Importantly, the covenant at Sinai was conditional. Blessings were promised for obedience. Consequences were warned for disobedience. This conditional nature of the relationship between God and Israel would later play a major role in how prophets explained national disasters. The idea that political or military failure could be a result of moral failure was deeply embedded in Israelite thinking, beginning with this covenant. The leadership structure during this period was charismatic and temporary. Moses served as the mediator, but as the community grew, he shared authority with elders and judges. There was no centralized government or permanent leader beyond the role of Moses himself. This decentralized model would continue into the next phase of Israel's history, the period of the judges. The wilderness experience also reinforced tribal identity. According to tradition, the Israelites were divided into 12 tribes, descended from the 12 sons of Jacob. While this system may have been more symbolic than literal, it provided a structure for organizing people, land distribution, and military duties. Each tribe had its own leaders but was expected to unite under shared religious obligations. After decades of wandering through the wilderness, the Israelites stood poised to enter the land that had long been promised to their ancestors. This next phase of their journey marked a dramatic transition, from nomadic existence to settled life, from a community shaped by shared hardship to one facing the new realities of land, agriculture, and territorial conflict. The conquest and settlement of Canaan would not be a single sweeping campaign, but a long, uneven process, full of challenges, negotiations, and local struggles. According to the book of Joshua, the Israelites crossed the Jordan River and began their military campaign with the famed fall of Jericho. In the biblical account, the walls of the city collapsed after 7 days of ritual circling and trumpet blasts. While this narrative is powerful and symbolic, the archaeological record offers a more complex picture. Excavations at Jericho suggest the city was already destroyed or abandoned by the late 13th century BCE, possibly earlier than the time frame traditionally assigned to Joshua's conquest. More broadly, archaeological surveys across Canaan reveal a pattern not of widespread destruction, but of gradual settlement. The central highlands saw a sharp increase in population between the 13th and 11th centuries BCE, with the establishment of hundreds of new villages. These settlements were often built on previously uninhabited or lightly inhabited land, suggesting that rather than conquering a heavily populated region, the Israelites were often settling in marginal zones that others had vacated or neglected. This view aligns with what many scholars describe as a mixed model of conquest, infiltration, and social transformation. While some cities may have been taken by force, others were likely integrated peacefully or bypassed altogether. In some areas, especially in the north, Israelites may have mingled with existing Canaanite populations, adopting and adapting local customs while maintaining distinct practices such as dietary laws and religious traditions centered on Yahweh. The biblical text itself reflects some of this complexity. While the book of Joshua presents a largely unified conquest narrative, the book of Judges tells a different story, one of incomplete victories, lingering enemies, and regional variation. In Judges, individual tribes struggle to take their allotted territories. Some drive out the inhabitants, others fail to do so, and some even coexist with Canaanite populations. This suggests that the settlement was less of a coordinated national campaign and more a series of tribal efforts spread over generations. The political landscape of Canaan during this period was fragmented. It was not a single nation but a patchwork of city-states, each ruled by its own king or council. Egyptian influence in the region had declined significantly after the withdrawal of garrisons in the late 13th century BCE, creating a power vacuum. This decline opened the door for new groups, including the Israelites, to establish a presence in the land without facing sustained imperial resistance. One of the clearest signs of early Israelite presence in Canaan is the construction of small, unwalled village settlements in the central highlands. These villages typically included stone houses arranged around communal courtyards, suggesting a focus on family units and shared agricultural work. There were few signs of luxury goods or centralized authority, indicating a relatively egalitarian social structure at this stage. Another key feature of this period is the emergence of Israelite religious practices centered around local altars and sacred sites. Unlike the urban temples of Egypt or Mesopotamia, these early Israelite places of worship were simple and decentralized. They featured standing stones, stone platforms, and occasionally animal sacrifices. The Ark of the Covenant, believed to house the stone tablets from Sinai, served as a mobile sacred object, emphasizing the continued connection between the people and their divine law. The tribal system also took shape during this time. The 12 tribes of Israel were each assigned a portion of land, though in practice, these boundaries were often fluid and contested. Tribal identity remained strong, with each tribe maintaining its own leadership and internal cohesion. At times, this tribal structure would serve as a source of strength, allowing for flexible responses to local threats. At other times, it would hinder unity, making collective action difficult. One of the notable early confrontations during the settlement period was with the Canaanite city of Hazor, located in the northern Galilee region. Hazor was one of the largest and most powerful cities in Canaan, and the book of Joshua claims it was burned by the Israelites. Archaeological evidence does show that Hazor was destroyed by fire in the late 13th century BCE, though the identity of the attackers remains debated. Whether this destruction was the work of Israelites, internal rebellion, or another group, it illustrates the turbulent nature of the era. Other cities, such as Shechem, played a different role. Rather than being destroyed, Shechem appears to have been peacefully integrated into the Israelite network and became an early religious and political center. According to the book of Joshua, a covenant ceremony was held at Shechem to renew Israel's commitment to Yahweh and the Mosaic Law. This event, if historical, may have helped unify the disparate tribes under a shared sense of purpose. Throughout the settlement period, the Israelites faced pressure not only from Canaanite city-states but also from external groups such as the Philistines, who had established themselves along the southern coast. These conflicts would intensify in later generations, eventually pushing the Israelites to consider more centralized forms of leadership. But during this early phase, leadership remained localized. Judges and elders led their own clans or tribes, and coordination across the whole of Israel was rare. Following the initial settlement in Canaan, the Israelites entered a period characterized by tribal independence, sporadic leadership, and frequent conflict. This phase of their history is known as the era of the Judges. Unlike monarchies or centralized states, Israel during this time operated as a loosely connected confederation of tribes, each managing its own affairs and defending its own territory. The judge, in this context, was not a courtroom official, but a charismatic leader, often a military deliverer or tribal elder, who rose to power in times of crisis. The Book of Judges, one of the historical books of the Hebrew Bible, outlines a recurring pattern that defined this era. The people would abandon their covenantal obligations and begin to adopt the practices of the surrounding peoples, particularly their religious customs. This would be followed by oppression at the hands of neighboring enemies, which in turn would lead to cries for help. In response, God would raise a judge to deliver Israel. After a period of peace, the cycle would repeat. This cycle of sin, oppression, repentance, and deliverance reflects both theological interpretation and historical reality. The tribal structure of early Israel provided resilience but also left the people vulnerable to disunity. Without a central government or standing army, each tribe had to defend its own borders and call for assistance when overwhelmed. Communication and coordination among tribes were inconsistent, and at times, tribal rivalries became as much of a threat as foreign enemies. The judges themselves were diverse in background, character, and capability. Some were warriors, others were prophets or statesmen. Perhaps the most well-known of these leaders was Deborah. Her story stands out not only because she was a woman in a patriarchal society, but also because she combined military leadership with judicial authority. According to the text, Deborah summoned Barak, a military commander, to lead the fight against the Canaanite general Sisera. Their victory at the Battle of Mount Tabor is celebrated in one of the oldest poems in the Hebrew Bible, the Song of Deborah. Another key figure was Gideon, who initially hesitated when called to leadership. The Midianites, a nomadic group from the east, were raiding Israelite settlements, stealing crops and livestock. Gideon eventually led a small band of men to victory through clever tactics and surprise attacks. Yet, despite his success, Gideon refused to become a king. He declared that God alone would rule over Israel. This moment highlights a tension that would grow in later generations: the struggle between maintaining tribal independence and forming a centralized monarchy. The story of Jephthah offers a more tragic example. A skilled warrior and outcast from his own family, Jephthah was called upon to lead in a time of danger. He secured victory over the Ammonites, but is remembered for a tragic vow he made before the battle, promising to sacrifice the first thing that came out of his house if he returned victorious. When his daughter greeted him, he fulfilled the vow, a story that illustrates both the power and peril of unrestrained leadership in a time lacking stable institutions. Perhaps the most famous judge was Samson, whose life was marked by strength, impulsiveness, and eventual redemption. His conflicts with the Philistines, who had become a major power on Israel's western border, reflected the growing threat of outside influence. Though Samson's personal flaws led to his downfall, his final act, bringing down the Philistine temple at the cost of his own life, was remembered as a symbol of divine justice. Throughout this period, threats came from various quarters. The Philistines were establishing city-states along the coastal plain, including Gaza, Ashdod, and Ekron. Their military strength and use of iron weaponry made them formidable adversaries. In the east, the Ammonites and Moabites challenged the Israelite tribes across the Jordan River. In the north, remnants of Canaanite city-states still posed problems, and tribal disputes occasionally erupted into civil strife. One of the most severe examples of internal conflict is found in the closing chapters of the Book of Judges, in which a violent incident involving the tribe of Benjamin led to a civil war. The other tribes, outraged by an act of brutality in the town of Gibeah, went to war against Benjamin, nearly wiping the tribe out. This story, though horrifying, reveals the fragility of Israelite unity and the dangers of moral and political collapse in the absence of strong collective leadership. The Book of Judges ends with a telling refrain. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This statement reflects more than a nostalgic view of centralized rule. It underscores a society struggling to maintain cohesion amid external threats and internal divisions. While the system of judges allowed for flexibility and local responsiveness, it lacked the continuity and strategic planning necessary for long-term stability. Religiously, this period was marked by inconsistency and local variation. High places and shrines to Yahweh existed across the land, but there was no single religious center. The influence of neighboring peoples, particularly the worship of Baal and Asherah, crept into Israelite practice. Prophets and priests attempted to resist these influences, but the lack of centralized oversight meant that syncretism, mixing of religious traditions, was widespread. The Ark of the Covenant, which had traveled with the Israelites through the wilderness, continued to serve as a symbol of divine presence. However, its location varied. At times, it was housed in places like Shiloh, but there was no fixed temple. This decentralized religious structure mirrored the political fragmentation of the era. Economically, the Israelites were transitioning from a primarily pastoral economy to one that included agriculture and village life. The need for irrigation, crop storage, and trade networks introduced new pressures and opportunities. Land ownership and inheritance laws began to take shape, but these were often challenged by population shifts and external raids. By the end of the period of the Judges, the Israelites were no longer content with their tribal system of governance. Repeated cycles of instability, foreign oppression, and internal conflict had convinced many that the existing model was inadequate for the challenges they faced. The growing strength of external enemies, particularly the Philistines, made it increasingly clear that a centralized authority was needed, one that could unify the tribes, lead armies into battle, and provide consistent leadership across the land. The call for a king did not emerge in a vacuum. The Israelites had observed the political structures of their neighbors. The Philistines were organized into powerful city-states, each with its own ruler, but capable of coordinated military action. To the east, kingdoms such as Moab, Ammon, and Edom had established monarchies with dynastic rule. Even among the remnants of the Canaanite cities, kingship remained the norm. In this regional context, Israel's tribal confederation looked increasingly outdated and vulnerable. The demand for a king came to a head during the leadership of the prophet Samuel. Samuel was a transitional figure, both the last of the judges and the first in a new line of prophets who would influence the Israelite monarchy. He was known for his wisdom, integrity, and devotion to Yahweh. Raised at the sanctuary in Shiloh, Samuel grew up in a religious environment and eventually became both a judge and a spiritual leader. His authority, however, was not enough to resolve the growing concerns among the tribes. As recorded in the first book of Samuel, the elders of Israel approached Samuel with a direct request. "Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." This request displeased Samuel, who saw it as a rejection not just of his leadership, but of divine kingship itself. Until this point, Yahweh had been regarded as the true king of Israel, with human leaders serving as temporary agents of divine will. The demand for a human king represented a major shift in political and theological thinking. Samuel prayed, and the divine response confirmed the gravity of the moment. "It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king." Despite his personal misgivings, Samuel was instructed to grant their request, but not without warning them of the consequences. He delivered a powerful speech outlining the costs of monarchy. A king would draft their sons into his army, take their daughters for service, seize their land and crops, and impose taxes. In other words, kingship would come with a price. Nevertheless, the people insisted. The political situation was too dire to continue with the old system. The Philistines had become a constant threat, pushing deeper into the interior and dominating key trade routes. Israel needed a king to lead them in battle and provide the cohesion that the tribal system lacked. Reluctantly, Samuel agreed to anoint a king. The first man chosen for this role was Saul, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. Saul's physical stature and presence made him an ideal candidate in the eyes of the people. He was tall, strong, and outwardly impressive. But his rise to power also marked the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter in Israelite history. Saul's anointing took place in private as Samuel poured oil over his head, a symbolic act of divine appointment. Later, Saul was publicly selected by lot before the assembled tribes, confirming his legitimacy in both religious and communal terms. His initial military successes, particularly his victory over the Ammonites at Jabesh Gilead, helped solidify his authority. For the first time, the tribes of Israel had a single leader who could rally them against their enemies. However, Saul's reign would be troubled from the beginning. His relationship with Samuel grew tense, especially as Saul began to act independently of prophetic guidance. On one occasion, Saul offered a sacrifice before battle without waiting for Samuel, a breach of religious protocol that Samuel saw as a serious offense. On another, Saul disobeyed a divine command to utterly destroy the Amalekites and their king, sparing the best livestock and King Agag. These actions led Samuel to declare that God had rejected Saul as king. The issue was not merely political incompetence, but theological failure. The Israelite king was expected to rule under divine authority, not as an autonomous figure. Saul's inability to obey prophetic instruction called into question his fitness for the role. It became clear that while the monarchy might solve some political problems, it introduced new tensions between royal power and religious authority. Despite these setbacks, Saul continued to rule and led several successful military campaigns. He fought against the Philistines, Moabites, Edomites, and Amalekites, securing Israelite territory and raising the kingdom's profile. Yet, his personal struggles, particularly his bouts of jealousy, paranoia, and depression, began to erode his leadership. These issues would come to the forefront with the rise of a young rival, David, a shepherd from the tribe of Judah. The introduction of monarchy transformed Israelite society. Centralized authority began to take shape. Royal administration, taxation, and conscription became part of daily life. The king's court introduced new levels of hierarchy and privilege. These changes brought order, but also inequality. The very concerns Samuel had warned about were starting to unfold. The establishment of Saul as Israel's first king was a groundbreaking moment in the life of the nation. His rise marked the transformation of Israel from a tribal confederation into a monarchy. But while Saul's early victories and symbolic power seemed promising, his reign would quickly reveal the complexities and difficulties of royal leadership in a land and culture still learning what kingship meant. His rule exposed tensions between divine authority and political power, between military necessity and spiritual obedience, and ultimately between personal instability and national unity. Saul came from the tribe of Benjamin, one of the smaller tribes of Israel. This origin may have been a deliberate choice to avoid favoring one of the dominant tribes, such as Ephraim or Judah, and to keep tribal rivalries in check. When he was publicly chosen by Lot and then confirmed by the prophet Samuel, Saul appeared as a unifying figure, someone acceptable to most factions, at least initially. One of Saul's first major tests came with the threat posed by the Ammonites. When the city of Jabesh-Gilead was besieged, Saul summoned the tribes to war. In a striking display of leadership, he gathered a large force and decisively defeated the Ammonite army. This victory earned him popular support and gave credibility to his kingship. For a time, Israel appeared united under his rule. However, challenges quickly followed. The most significant and persistent external threat during Saul's reign came from the Philistines. Militarily advanced and politically organized, the Philistines controlled key areas of the coastal plain and exerted pressure on Israel's western frontier. Their use of iron weaponry gave them a technological edge. Moreover, they had established fortified cities and a confederated political system that allowed for coordinated military action. Saul faced difficulty mobilizing and sustaining large-scale military campaigns against them. Unlike the Philistines, Israel lacked a professional army and depended on tribal militias. The disunity and irregular organization of these forces became evident in confrontations such as the battle at Michmash, where Israel's troops were vastly outnumbered. Despite this, Saul's son Jonathan, along with his armor-bearer, executed a daring attack that led to a surprising victory. The courage shown by Jonathan highlighted the individual heroism that sometimes compensated for Israel's structural weaknesses. But military issues were only part of Saul's problem. His relationship with the prophet Samuel, once his greatest supporter, began to deteriorate. This decline was not simply personal. It reflected a deeper issue about the source of legitimate authority in Israel. Samuel, representing the prophetic and priestly tradition, insisted that the king must rule in submission to divine law. Saul, facing immediate military and political pressures, at times acted independently, violating religious norms. One critical moment occurred when Saul prepared for battle and chose to offer a sacrifice himself instead of waiting for Samuel, who had not yet arrived. This act, though perhaps understandable in the moment, was seen as a serious breach of protocol. Samuel rebuked Saul, declaring that his kingdom would not endure because he had acted foolishly and disobeyed the command of the Lord. The most damaging incident came during Saul's campaign against the Amalekites. According to divine instruction, delivered through Samuel, Saul was to destroy the Amalekites completely, men, women, children, and livestock. This harsh command, in line with the practice of herem or devotion to destruction, was meant to serve as a judgment on the Amalekites for their earlier attacks on Israel. Saul, however, spared King Agag and kept the best of the livestock, allegedly to use as sacrifices. When Samuel confronted Saul, he responded by justifying his actions. But Samuel's response was clear and uncompromising. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. This confrontation marked a turning point. Samuel declared that Saul had rejected the word of the Lord, and therefore the Lord had rejected Saul as king. From this point onward, Saul's reign became increasingly troubled. Though he remained on the throne, he no longer enjoyed the full support of the prophetic establishment. The Spirit of the Lord, according to the biblical narrative, departed from him, and he was afflicted by bouts of psychological torment. These episodes are described as being soothed only by the music of a young harpist, David, the son of Jesse from Bethlehem. David's entry into Saul's court would have lasting consequences. Initially brought in as a musician, David soon gained fame as a warrior after defeating the Philistine champion Goliath. This act of bravery captured the imagination of the people and earned him a place in Saul's military leadership. David's success in battle made him popular among the people, even as it sowed seeds of jealousy and suspicion in Saul's mind. As David's reputation grew, Saul's insecurity deepened. Though Saul had once seen David as an ally, he now viewed him as a threat. The resulting tension turned into open hostility. Saul tried on multiple occasions to kill David, who fled and lived as a fugitive, gathering a band of followers and moving through the wilderness and borderlands. This internal conflict weakened Saul's authority and fragmented Israel's unity. While Saul remained king, a growing number of people began to view David as the divinely chosen successor. The prophet Samuel, before his death, had already anointed David in secret. Though David would not challenge Saul directly, his increasing influence and the loyalty he commanded made the transfer of power inevitable. Saul's final years were marked by desperation and tragedy. In one of the most telling episodes, he sought the help of a medium at Endor to summon the spirit of Samuel, who had died. The encounter was somber. Samuel's spirit confirmed Saul's worst fears. The kingdom had been taken from him, and he would fall in battle. That battle came against the Philistines at Mount Gilboa. The Israelite forces were defeated, and Saul's sons, including Jonathan, were killed. Facing capture, Saul fell on his own sword. His body was later desecrated by the Philistines, who displayed it on the walls of Beth-shan. The people of Jabesh-Gilead, in an act of gratitude and honor, recovered the bodies and gave them a proper burial. With the death of Saul, Israel stood at a crossroads. The dream of a unified kingdom had barely begun before it was threatened by fragmentation. Saul's death left a leadership vacuum, and although David had long been anointed by the prophet Samuel and enjoyed widespread popular support, the path to uncontested rule would take time, patience, and political skill. The unification of the tribes under David marked the true beginning of Israel as a centralized and powerful kingdom, and his reign laid the foundation for what would later be remembered as a golden age in Israelite history. Following the defeat at Mount Gilboa, Saul's body was taken by the Philistines and displayed as a trophy. But while the Philistines celebrated their victory, Israelite unity unraveled. The northern tribes, still loyal to Saul's dynasty, proclaimed Saul's son Ishbosheth as king. He ruled from Mahanaim in the region east of the Jordan River. Meanwhile, David was publicly anointed king in Hebron by the tribe of Judah, his own tribe and power base. The nation was now divided between two rival centers of power, Judah in the south and the remaining tribes in the north. The ensuing civil war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted several years. It was not merely a military struggle, but also a contest for legitimacy. David had the advantage of tribal loyalty, political acumen, and the symbolic backing of divine anointing. His military commander Joab was instrumental in securing key victories. Yet David avoided unnecessary bloodshed when possible. His strategic patience eventually paid off. The turning point came when Abner, the commander of Saul's army, defected to David. Abner had grown disillusioned with Ishbosheth's weak leadership and sought to unify the kingdom under David. However, Abner was assassinated by Joab in a personal act of revenge, which nearly derailed the political reconciliation. David, aware of the potential consequences, publicly mourned Abner and distanced himself from the killing. This action solidified his reputation as a just and moderate leader rather than a ruthless usurper. Soon after, Ishbosheth was murdered by two of his own men. Once again, David took a stand against political violence, executing the assassins for their crime. With the rival dynasty removed and no viable heirs remaining, the northern tribes came to David voluntarily. At Hebron, leaders from all the tribes approached him and declared, "We are your own flesh and blood." They anointed David king over all Israel, symbolizing the first genuine national unity under a single monarch. David was around 30 years old at the time he became king over the united tribes. His first major move as king was to establish a neutral and strategically located capital, Jerusalem. At that time, Jerusalem was a Canaanite stronghold inhabited by the Jebusites. It had not belonged to any specific Israelite tribe, making it an ideal choice for unifying the nation. David led a successful campaign to conquer the city and renamed it the City of David. Jerusalem's significance went beyond geography. David made it not only the political capital, but also the religious center of Israel. He brought the Ark of the Covenant to the city, giving it spiritual weight and associating his rule with divine blessing. The Ark, once a mobile symbol of God's presence among the people, now found a home within David's new capital. This move further bound national identity to both religious tradition and David's kingship. With the capital established, David turned to securing Israel's borders. He led successful military campaigns against the Philistines, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, and Arameans. These victories extended Israel's influence and created a buffer zone of subdued territories. For the first time in Israelite history, the kingdom held a regional presence that rivaled neighboring powers. Tribute from vassal states enriched the treasury, and fortified garrisons helped maintain security. One of the hallmarks of David's reign was his ability to blend military strength with political diplomacy. He formed alliances through marriage and maintained a network of loyal officials. His administration included a professional army, scribes, and counselors. This bureaucratic development marked a shift from the tribal, ad hoc systems of earlier periods to a structured royal court. Governance, once the domain of elders and judges, now took place in a centralized monarchy with clearly defined roles. David also showed a deep interest in religious matters, although his approach was pragmatic. While he respected priestly authority and maintained close relations with figures like the priest Zadok and the prophet Nathan, he also exercised kingly control over religious practices. His plan to build a permanent temple for the Ark in Jerusalem was a major initiative, although he was ultimately told by Nathan that this task would be left to his son. Despite David's achievements, his reign was not without challenges. His consolidation of power often came at the expense of traditional tribal autonomy, and his growing court culture introduced new forms of inequality and privilege. Yet the gains in unity, stability, and international stature were undeniable. For many Israelites, David's reign became the model of ideal kingship, a time when the nation was united, secure, and guided by a leader who sought the favor of God. David's personal charisma and ability to connect with the people also contributed to his success. He was known for his poetic skill and musical talent, attributes that helped shape the religious and cultural identity of the nation. Many of the Psalms are attributed to David and reflect themes of trust, repentance, praise, and kingship. Through these writings, David's voice would echo long after his death, further embedding his legacy in the spiritual life of Israel. As David's reign advanced, his early successes gave way to a series of personal and political crises that tested both his character and his kingdom. While he had united the tribes and established Jerusalem as a powerful capital, David's later years were marked by scandal, internal conflict, and bitter family rivalries. These events did not undo his achievements, but they cast a long shadow over his legacy and complicated the question of succession. For all his triumphs, David would also be remembered as a deeply flawed man whose personal failings had national consequences. The turning point came during a time when David remained in Jerusalem while his army was away at war. From the rooftop of his palace, he saw Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, bathing. David summoned her, and she became pregnant. To cover up the situation, David first attempted to bring Uriah home from the battlefield to spend time with his wife. When Uriah refused out of loyalty to his fellow soldiers, David arranged for him to be placed at the front lines of battle, where he was killed. This event, the taking of Bathsheba and the death of Uriah, was a moment of moral failure that deeply altered David's reputation. The prophet Nathan confronted him with a parable that exposed the injustice of his actions. David responded with repentance, acknowledging his guilt. Nathan assured him that God had forgiven him, but he also warned that the sword would never depart from David's house. This prophecy foreshadowed the family and political turmoil that would soon follow. David and Bathsheba's first child died shortly after birth, a loss that David accepted as part of his punishment. Their second son, however, was Solomon, who would later play a central role in Israel's history. Yet before Solomon could rise to prominence, David's household would be shaken by violence and betrayal. One of David's sons, Amnon, became infatuated with his half-sister Tamar. Through deception and manipulation, Amnon lured her into a private setting and assaulted her. After the incident, he rejected her and cast her aside, compounding the offense. David was angry but took no formal action, perhaps due to the complicated family dynamics and his own moral failures. Absalom, Tamar's full brother, was enraged by the injustice. After waiting 2 years, he arranged for Amnon to be killed during a feast. Then he fled into exile. This act of vengeance tore the royal family apart and created a rift between David and Absalom that would take years to mend. Eventually, David allowed Absalom to return to Jerusalem, but their relationship remained strained. Absalom gradually began to undermine his father's authority by presenting himself as a more accessible and just leader. He stood at the city gate, listening to the grievances of the people and subtly casting doubt on David's ability to govern. His charisma and ambition gained him a following, and in time, Absalom declared himself king in Hebron, sparking a full-scale rebellion. David, upon hearing of the revolt, fled Jerusalem with his loyal followers. The image of the aged king, barefoot and weeping as he crossed the Kidron Valley, became one of the most poignant scenes in the biblical narrative. Despite the betrayal, David refused to retaliate with cruelty. He ordered his troops to deal gently with Absalom, even as they prepared for battle. The two armies met in the forest of Ephraim. The terrain proved treacherous, and Absalom, while riding his mule, became entangled in the branches of a tree. Caught and helpless, he was killed by Joab, David's general, despite David's explicit instructions. When news of Absalom's death reached David, he mourned deeply, crying, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would that I had died instead of you." The rebellion had been put down, but the cost was heavy. David returned to Jerusalem, weary and diminished. His authority was restored, but his house was broken. In the years that followed, further unrest and intrigue continued to plague the court. Another of David's sons, Adonijah, attempted to claim the throne as David grew older and weaker. At this time, the question of succession became critical. Traditionally, the eldest surviving son might have been expected to inherit the throne. But Bathsheba, along with the prophet Nathan, intervened to ensure that Solomon, her son, would be David's chosen successor. With David's blessing, Solomon was anointed and declared king while David was still alive, forestalling Adonijah's ambitions. David's final instructions to Solomon were both spiritual and political. He urged his son to follow the ways of God, to keep the commandments, and to act wisely. But he also gave Solomon a list of political tasks, unfinished business involving former allies and enemies, revealing the complex blend of faith and realpolitik that characterized David's rule. David reigned for around 40 years, and his impact on Israelite history was profound. He had united the tribes, expanded the kingdom's borders, established a capital, and created a royal legacy. He had also shaped the nation's religious life, bringing the Ark to Jerusalem and preparing the way for a permanent temple. The death of David marked the end of a dramatic and foundational chapter in Israel's history. His son Solomon, born of Bathsheba, inherited not just a throne, but a vision of unity, prosperity, and sacred kingship. Under Solomon, Israel would reach the height of its political power, economic influence, and cultural sophistication. His reign would be remembered as a golden age, yet it would also sow the seeds of future division, as the structures he built demanded heavy burdens, and the unity he inherited began to fracture under the weight of its own ambitions. Solomon ascended the throne amid political uncertainty. His half-brother Adonijah had attempted to claim the crown, and even after Solomon's coronation, Adonijah continued to maneuver for power. Solomon acted swiftly and decisively. With the support of his mother Bathsheba and the prophet Nathan, he consolidated power, neutralizing potential threats to his rule. Key rivals, including Adonijah and General Joab, were removed from the scene. This early show of strength established Solomon's control and made clear that his reign would not be undermined by internal challenge. One of Solomon's first recorded acts as king was his appeal to God for wisdom. In a dream at Gibeon, God offered him anything he desired. Solomon famously asked not for riches or victory, but for an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. This request pleased God, and Solomon was granted not only wisdom but also wealth, honor, and a long reign, if he remained faithful. Solomon's wisdom became legendary. Tales spread of his wise judgments, the most famous being the case of two women claiming to be the mother of the same child. Solomon proposed to divide the child in two, prompting the real mother to reveal herself by pleading for the child's life. This story, and many others, cemented his reputation as a just and perceptive ruler. Solomon's reign saw significant developments in administration, infrastructure, diplomacy, and religion. He reorganized the kingdom's governance by dividing it into 12 districts, each responsible for providing provisions for the royal court for 1 month of the year. This system, while efficient, placed significant demands on the people and often ignored traditional tribal boundaries, which may have weakened older structures of local identity and loyalty. Economically, Solomon expanded Israel's role in international trade. The kingdom benefited from its strategic location at the crossroads of major routes linking Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean. Solomon developed alliances with neighboring powers, most notably through his partnership with Hiram, king of Tyre. This alliance brought skilled labor and materials, especially cedar wood from Lebanon, that would play a crucial role in Solomon's most ambitious building project, the construction of the Temple in Jerusalem. The Temple, often referred to as Solomon's Temple, became the religious centerpiece of the nation. It replaced the tabernacle, the mobile sanctuary used during the wilderness period, and provided a permanent home for the Ark of the Covenant. Built on Mount Moriah, the temple was constructed with great care and splendor. It took 7 years to complete and involved vast quantities of stone, wood, and gold. Foreign craftsmen, laborers conscripted from the Israelite population, and administrative overseers worked together to realize the king's vision. The dedication of the temple was a deeply symbolic moment. Solomon led prayers and sacrifices, invoking the covenant between God and Israel. He acknowledged that no building could contain the divine presence, but asked that the temple be a place where prayers would be heard and mercy granted. The ark was brought into the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, and the glory of the Lord was said to have filled the house. This centralization of worship in Jerusalem marked a shift in Israel's religious life. Local altars and shrines, long used throughout the tribal territories, were now considered secondary to the temple. The priesthood, led by Zadok and his descendants, gained institutional authority. Pilgrimage to Jerusalem became a national religious practice. While these changes helped unify the kingdom, they also concentrated power in the capital and further distanced the monarchy from rural populations. Solomon's interest in building was not limited to the temple. He constructed a royal palace that took 13 years to complete, suggesting a scale and grandeur even greater than that of the temple. He also fortified key cities such as Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer, built store cities and military outposts, and developed a fleet at Etzion-Geber on the Red Sea. These projects enhanced the kingdom's security and economic potential but came at a steep cost. Labor conscription, heavy taxation, and central control began to place growing pressure on the population. Diplomatically, Solomon pursued peace through marriage alliances. The most notable of these was his marriage to the daughter of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. This alliance marked a significant elevation in Israel's international status, as Egyptian royalty typically did not offer daughters in marriage to foreign rulers. Solomon also married many other foreign women, forming alliances with Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. These marriages brought political benefits but also religious complications, as many of these women continued to worship their native deities. According to the biblical account, Solomon eventually built high places and altars to accommodate the religious practices of his foreign wives. This development provoked strong criticism in the biblical narrative, which viewed these actions as a direct violation of Israel's covenant with God. The text portrays Solomon's later years as marked by spiritual compromise and disobedience, leading to divine displeasure. God's response, as conveyed by the prophet Ahijah, was a declaration that the kingdom would be torn apart after Solomon's death. However, for the sake of David, the division would not happen during Solomon's lifetime, and the tribe of Judah would retain loyalty to David's house. This prophecy anticipated the great schism that would come soon after Solomon's passing, a division that would permanently alter the history of the Israelite people. Despite these critiques, Solomon's reign left an enduring legacy. His rule brought peace, prosperity, and cultural flourishing. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs are traditionally attributed to him, though their authorship remains debated. These writings reflect a period of reflection, philosophical inquiry, and poetic expression that added richness to Israelite religious and literary life. When Solomon died, the kingdom of Israel stood at the peak of its political and territorial power. Jerusalem had become a central place of worship, the temple had elevated religious life, and Israel was widely respected by neighboring states. But beneath the grandeur lay growing tensions, regional grievances, economic burdens, and questions of identity and leadership. These unresolved issues would soon boil over, leading to a rupture so profound that it permanently divided the kingdom. What had once been a united monarchy would split into two rival states, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. The crisis began almost immediately after Solomon's death. His son Rehoboam traveled to Shechem, a major city in the central hill country, to be confirmed as king by the northern tribes. This choice of location was itself significant. Shechem had long-standing historical and spiritual importance for the northern tribes and had served as a major gathering place during earlier eras of tribal leadership. By meeting there rather than in Jerusalem, Rehoboam acknowledged, at least symbolically, the need to gain the support of the northern regions. But the people of the north, led by Jeroboam, had come with specific demands. Jeroboam was not a new figure. During Solomon's reign, he had been a prominent official overseeing forced labor in the northern territories. He was well known and popular among the northern tribes, particularly the tribe of Ephraim. When he had once spoken out against Solomon's policies, he was forced into exile in Egypt. Now, with Solomon gone, Jeroboam returned to challenge the new king. At Shechem, Jeroboam and the assembly of Israelite leaders approached Rehoboam with a request: reduce the heavy burden of labor and taxation that had been imposed during Solomon's reign. Your father made our yoke heavy, they said. Now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. It was a moment of negotiation, an opportunity to heal the growing divide and solidify national unity under new leadership. Rehoboam asked for 3 days to consider their request. He consulted 2 groups of advisors. The older counselors who had served Solomon advised him to speak gently to the people and show them kindness. They recognized that servant leadership could win loyalty and preserve the kingdom. But the younger men, Rehoboam's peers, urged him to assert dominance and strength. My little finger is thicker than my father's waist, they said. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. Rehoboam chose the path of arrogance and coercion. When he returned to the assembly, he rejected the people's plea and threatened even harsher treatment than that of his father. His words were a direct insult to the northern tribes, and the breaking point. The response was swift and decisive. The northern tribes declared, "What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David." With that, the 10 northern tribes broke away from the Davidic monarchy and made Jeroboam their king. Only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to the house of David. The unified kingdom had lasted only 2 generations. Now, 2 separate kingdoms emerged. The kingdom of Israel in the north, with its capital eventually in Samaria, and the kingdom of Judah in the south, with Jerusalem remaining its political and religious heart. This division was not merely political, it had deep social and religious consequences. The northern kingdom, with more territory and a larger population, was economically and strategically powerful. It included key cities, trade routes, and fertile agricultural land. The southern kingdom, though smaller and more centralized, retained the temple and the Davidic dynasty, which provided a powerful source of legitimacy and continuity. Jeroboam, now king of the northern kingdom, faced an immediate dilemma. Jerusalem and the temple remained in Judah, and pilgrimage to Jerusalem was a central part of Israelite religious life. Fearing that continued allegiance to the southern religious center might undermine his authority, Jeroboam introduced new religious practices to solidify his control. He established 2 alternative worship centers, one in Bethel and the other in Dan, and placed golden calves at each site. These were not presented as new gods, but as visible symbols of Yahweh, similar to earlier religious iconography. Nonetheless, the move was deeply controversial and seen by later biblical writers as a grave sin. Jeroboam also appointed non-Levitical priests and established alternative festivals to replace those observed in Jerusalem. His intention was clear: to create a distinct religious identity for the northern kingdom, one that would prevent his subjects from turning back to the Davidic monarchy. However, these changes would have long-term theological consequences. The Deuteronomistic historians, who shaped the biblical narrative, condemned Jeroboam for causing Israel to sin. From their perspective, he broke the sacred connection between the people and the place God had chosen for his name, Jerusalem. In Judah, Rehoboam worked to stabilize his now smaller kingdom. He fortified cities, maintained a standing army, and continued the temple-centered religious life initiated by his father. The Levites and other loyalists who opposed Jeroboam's reforms migrated to Judah, strengthening its religious institutions. Nevertheless, Judah faced its own challenges. In the 5th year of Rehoboam's reign, Egypt's pharaoh Shishak invaded and plundered Jerusalem, taking treasures from the temple and royal palace. This event was a sobering reminder that Judah, without the full strength of the United Kingdom, was now more vulnerable to foreign threats. The schism marked the beginning of a new and more fragmented era in Israelite history. The two kingdoms would exist side by side for over 2 centuries, often in tension, sometimes in open conflict, and occasionally in alliance. Each would have its own line of kings, its own prophets, and its own trajectory. The north, though larger and wealthier, would suffer from frequent dynastic instability. The south, while smaller, maintained dynastic continuity through the line of David. Culturally, the divide led to variations in worship, politics, and historical memory. Prophets such as Hosea and Amos would later warn the northern kingdom about its religious compromises and social injustices, while prophets in Judah, such as Isaiah and Micah, would focus on themes of faithfulness and reform. The division also influenced the composition of biblical literature. Later writers and redactors, many of whom were based in Judah, portrayed the northern kingdom's religious innovations negatively, casting Judah as the true heir of the covenant. This perspective shaped how history was remembered and how theological judgments were framed. Following the Great Schism, the northern tribes had severed their political and religious ties with the house of David. With Jeroboam established as their ruler, the newly formed Kingdom of Israel now faced the challenge of shaping a distinct national identity. No longer bound to Jerusalem or the Davidic monarchy, the kingdom needed to build new institutions, centralize authority, and foster loyalty among its diverse tribal communities. This was a formative period in the history of the northern kingdom, as it sought to secure its borders, define its leadership, and establish religious and political independence. Jeroboam ruled over a territory far larger than Judah. The kingdom of Israel stretched from the territory of Naphtali in the far north to the tribal lands of Ephraim and Manasseh in the central highlands, reaching down into the eastern Jordan Valley. This gave Israel control over vital trade routes and fertile agricultural zones, boosting its economic potential. However, the same diversity of land and people also posed administrative challenges. Jeroboam had to unify tribes with distinct traditions, loyalties, and expectations. Initially, Jeroboam ruled from Shechem, a city with deep ancestral significance. Located in the hill country of Ephraim, Shechem had long served as a religious and political center for the northern tribes. It was the site of earlier covenantal gatherings and held symbolic value as a place of tribal unity. By choosing Shechem as his first capital, Jeroboam aimed to align his rule with long-standing northern traditions and distance his authority from Jerusalem's influence. However, Shechem may not have offered the stability or defensibility that Jeroboam required. Soon after establishing his rule, he moved the administrative center to Penuel, east of the Jordan River. This move suggests an attempt to strengthen control over the eastern territories, particularly those vulnerable to outside threats such as the Arameans or Ammonites. But this location also proved temporary. Eventually, Jeroboam shifted the capital to Tirzah, a city situated in the central region of the northern kingdom. Tirzah offered a more permanent administrative base and would remain Israel's capital for several decades. These moves reflect Jeroboam's ongoing efforts to consolidate power and reinforce territorial control. Unlike Jerusalem, which had the temple as a unifying symbol, the northern kingdom lacked a central religious structure. Jeroboam knew that allowing his subjects to continue traveling to Jerusalem for religious festivals risked reawakening their loyalty to the southern kingdom and the Davidic line. His solution was radical and strategic. Jeroboam established 2 major worship centers within his own kingdom, one in Bethel, near the southern border with Judah, and the other in Dan, at the northernmost edge. At each site, he placed a golden calf and declared, "Here is your God, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." These images were not necessarily intended as new deities, but were likely meant to represent Yahweh in visible form, much like earlier traditions of sacred bulls or cherubim. Still, this innovation was controversial. To further institutionalize these changes, Jeroboam appointed non-Levitical priests and created new religious festivals to rival those held in Jerusalem. These acts were not merely administrative. They represented a full-scale reorientation of religious practice. The aim was clear: to sever Israel's spiritual dependence on Jerusalem and to forge a religious identity distinct from Judah's temple-centric model. While these policies may have strengthened Jeroboam's short-term authority, they provoked lasting theological criticism. Later biblical writers, especially those writing from Judah, viewed these reforms as heretical and portrayed Jeroboam as the king who caused Israel to sin. This phrase would become a recurring judgment against nearly every future king of the northern kingdom. From the perspective of the Deuteronomistic historians, Jeroboam's religious policies marked the beginning of a downward spiral that would ultimately lead to Israel's destruction. Nevertheless, from a political standpoint, Jeroboam's moves were effective. He created a functional administrative system, oversaw infrastructure projects, and maintained independence from Judah. His reign lasted for over 2 decades, suggesting a measure of internal stability. His ability to maintain authority over 10 diverse tribes in a newly formed kingdom facing external and internal pressures was a considerable achievement. Despite this, Jeroboam's rule was not free from external threats. Egypt, under Pharaoh Shishak, posed a danger to both Judah and Israel. While Shishak famously invaded Judah and plundered Jerusalem, records also suggest that he campaigned in the northern territories. A list of towns attributed to Shishak's campaign includes several cities in Israelite territory, indicating that Jeroboam's kingdom was not immune to foreign intervention. This early test of sovereignty would not be the last, as Israel's geopolitical position placed it between larger, ambitious powers such as Egypt, Aram Damascus, and eventually Assyria. Jeroboam was succeeded by his son Nadab, whose reign was short-lived. After only a few years, Nadab was assassinated during a military campaign by a man named Baasha from the tribe of Issachar. Baasha then exterminated the entire house of Jeroboam to secure his own position. This violent transfer of power set a pattern that would repeat throughout Israel's history. Unlike Judah, which maintained dynastic continuity through the line of David, the northern kingdom suffered from frequent coups and abrupt regime changes. Baasha moved the capital from Tirzah and continued Jeroboam's religious policies, maintaining the shrines at Bethel and Dan. He ruled for over 2 decades and waged periodic wars against Judah. One of his strategies included fortifying the border city of Ramah to block access between Judah and the north. However, this plan was thwarted when Judah's king Asa bribed the Arameans to attack Israel from the north, forcing Baasha to abandon his efforts. This era highlighted Israel's growing entanglement in regional politics. The northern kingdom was geographically exposed and diplomatically vulnerable. Its leaders often pursued short-term alliances and reactive strategies to manage threats. With each dynastic change, the kingdom reset its internal policies, creating further instability. As the Kingdom of Israel developed into a separate political entity, it also pursued a path of religious independence that would define its identity and draw intense criticism from both prophets and later biblical writers. The division between Israel in the north and Judah in the south was not only a matter of geography and governance, it was also a profound spiritual rupture. In this section, we explore how competing temples, revised rituals, and theological divergence deepened the split between the two kingdoms and how prophetic voices began to emerge in response to these shifts. When Jeroboam established sanctuaries at Bethel and Dan, he was not merely offering convenience to his people. He was deliberately reshaping the religious landscape of the northern kingdom. Jerusalem, with its temple and priesthood, remained the theological center for Judah, but it was now politically foreign to Israel. Jeroboam's decision to create alternative sacred spaces was aimed at severing the emotional and spiritual bonds that connected the Israelites to Jerusalem and to the Davidic dynasty. The golden calves installed at Bethel and Dan became powerful visual symbols. Jeroboam likely intended them to represent the presence of Yahweh, echoing earlier traditions such as the cherubim over the Ark of the Covenant. However, the association with calf imagery also evoked memories of the golden calf incident during the wilderness period, a moment condemned as idolatrous. Whether Jeroboam viewed these statues as idols or as symbols is debated, but biblical authors writing from a southern perspective condemned them unequivocally. To support his new religious infrastructure, Jeroboam also made changes to the priesthood. He appointed priests from among the general population, rather than restricting the role to Levites as had been done in the Jerusalem tradition. This move ensured loyalty to his regime but broke with long-standing conventions. He instituted a festival in the 8th month to mirror or replace the Festival of Booths, celebrated in the 7th month in Jerusalem. These innovations were designed to establish a full parallel system of worship, separate from Judah's model. While Jeroboam's reforms may have been politically expedient, they introduced theological ambiguity. In the eyes of many, including later prophets, Israel had strayed from its covenant with Yahweh. This sense of spiritual deviation sparked the emergence of prophetic figures who would challenge the authority of kings and call the people back to faithfulness. One of the earliest known prophets to address this religious divergence was Ahijah of Shiloh. It was Ahijah who originally anointed Jeroboam as king, delivering the prophecy that 10 tribes would be torn away from the house of David. But later, when Jeroboam's policies veered from covenantal norms, Ahijah condemned him, predicting disaster for his house. Ahijah's shift signaled a critical development in Israelite religion. Prophets were not simply royal advisors or court officials. They were independent voices who claimed to speak on behalf of God, often in defiance of political power. This prophetic tradition would become central to Israel's religious and ethical life. Prophets were not bound by dynastic loyalty or temple hierarchy. They operated outside institutional structures and were often opposed to them. Their authority came not from lineage or office, but from a perceived divine calling. The reigns that followed Jeroboam continued to uphold the religious framework he had established. Baasha, Zimri, and Omri, among others, retained the cultic centers at Bethel and Dan. The biblical texts repeatedly accuse these kings of walking in the way of Jeroboam and perpetuating the sins he had introduced. This phrase became a theological indictment, highlighting the deepening divide between Israel's kings and the covenantal standards upheld by the prophets. In contrast, Judah maintained its religious life centered in Jerusalem and under the guidance of the Zadokite priesthood. The temple remained the central place of worship, and although Judah also struggled with its own spiritual failings, it did not experience the same degree of religious fragmentation seen in the north. The competing religious systems had broader cultural implications. The northern kingdom's openness to incorporating local and foreign religious elements reflected a more syncretistic approach. This was partly due to its geographic location, which brought Israel into frequent contact with Phoenician, Aramean, and Canaanite religious influences. Shrines and high places proliferated, and local deities were often worshipped alongside Yahweh. Fertility cults, Asherah poles, and Baal worship gained prominence in some regions. This trend was not simply a matter of theology, it had political consequences. Kings who tolerated or promoted religious syncretism often found themselves criticized for weakening national identity and moral standards. Moreover, as the line between religious and political loyalty blurred, prophets warned that idolatry would bring divine judgment in the form of military defeat and national decline. The prophetic critique gained strength as the political situation in the region deteriorated. Neighboring powers such as Aram, Damascus, and Assyria began to assert themselves more aggressively, threatening the security of the northern kingdom. Prophets began to link Israel's external vulnerability with its internal unfaithfulness. The message was clear. Abandonment of covenantal worship would lead to disaster. Despite these warnings, Israel's kings generally resisted prophetic calls for reform. The cultic centers at Bethel and Dan remained in operation, and royal support for alternative worship practices continued. This defiance set the stage for future confrontations between prophets and kings, conflicts that would define much of Israel's history in the following generations. The religious schism also shaped Israel's legacy. When later generations reflected on the causes of the northern kingdom's downfall, they consistently pointed to Jeroboam's innovations as the origin of its spiritual decline. The judgment passed down in the biblical narrative was severe. Jeroboam had not merely introduced political reforms, he had led the people into sin and set them on a path that would culminate in exile. By the early 9th century BCE, the Kingdom of Israel had entered a new phase of consolidation and state-building under a powerful new ruling family, the Omride dynasty. Founded by the military commander Omri, this royal line would bring political stability, urban development, and regional influence unmatched by earlier kings. Yet it would also be marked by deep religious controversy and confrontation with the prophetic movement. Omri and his son Ahab governed a strong and expanding state, but their legacy was ultimately shaped as much by their embrace of foreign alliances and cultic practices as by their political successes. Omri came to power during a time of chaos and uncertainty. After the brief and violent reigns of Zimri and Tibni, Omri seized control and established a firm grip over the kingdom. Although the biblical record offers limited detail about his reign, archaeological and external sources present a different picture, one of a capable and ambitious ruler. One of Omri's most lasting contributions was the establishment of a new capital, Samaria. Situated on a defensible hill and surrounded by fertile land, Samaria offered both military advantage and agricultural wealth. Omri purchased the site from a man named Shemer, from whom the city took its name. There, he built a royal palace and administrative center, shifting the political focus away from the earlier capitals like Shechem and Tirzah. Over time, Samaria grew into a prominent urban center, symbolizing the growing sophistication of the northern kingdom. Omri also strengthened Israel's international standing. The Assyrian records from the 9th century BCE refer to Israel as the House of Omri, even generations after his death. This title indicates that Omri was recognized across the region as a powerful figure whose dynasty carried weight in international affairs. He forged important alliances and established diplomatic connections with surrounding kingdoms, laying the groundwork for a new era of prosperity. One of Omri's most significant foreign alliances was with the Phoenician city of Sidon, secured through the marriage of his son Ahab to Jezebel, the daughter of the Sidonian king Ethbaal. This marriage brought political benefits, including access to Phoenician trade networks, naval technology, and economic wealth. However, it also brought religious complications that would become a central issue in Ahab's reign. Ahab inherited a kingdom at its political and economic peak. He fortified Samaria, expanded Israelite territory, and maintained military strength sufficient to challenge Syria and withstand Assyrian pressure. He built an ivory-adorned palace and was known for his administrative capabilities. Under his rule, the kingdom flourished in terms of wealth, construction, and diplomacy. But Ahab's reign was also defined by his religious choices. Influenced by Jezebel, he promoted the worship of Baal, the Phoenician storm and fertility god. A temple to Baal was erected in Samaria, and prophets of Baal were brought into the royal court. Jezebel also supported the worship of Asherah, a Canaanite mother goddess, further deepening the kingdom's involvement with foreign cults. These actions triggered fierce resistance from the prophetic community, especially from the prophet Elijah. Elijah emerged as one of the most powerful and uncompromising voices against royal idolatry. He condemned Ahab's religious policies as betrayals of the covenant with Yahweh and became a symbol of prophetic defiance in the face of royal authority. The confrontation between Elijah and Ahab reached its peak during the famous showdown on Mount Carmel. In response to a prolonged drought, interpreted as divine judgment, Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal to a contest. Each side would prepare a sacrifice and call upon their god to send fire from heaven. The prophets of Baal cried out in vain, but when Elijah prayed, fire descended and consumed the offering. The people responded by seizing the prophets of Baal, who were then executed. This dramatic event reinforced Elijah's message that Yahweh, not Baal, was the true God of Israel. Yet the victory did not bring an end to religious conflict. Jezebel, enraged by the deaths of the Baal prophets, vowed to kill Elijah. He fled into the wilderness, disheartened and exhausted. There, he experienced a profound encounter with God, not in fire or wind, but in a gentle whisper. This moment emphasized a new dimension of prophetic calling, not just public confrontation, but spiritual resilience and quiet faith. Ahab's troubles were not limited to religious issues. His acquisition of a vineyard owned by a man named Naboth triggered another major crisis. When Naboth refused to sell his land, Jezebel orchestrated a false trial and had him executed. Ahab then seized the vineyard. This blatant abuse of power provoked another prophetic rebuke from Elijah, who declared that disaster would come upon Ahab's house and that Jezebel would meet a violent end. The story of Naboth's vineyard became a lasting symbol of injustice and the misuse of royal authority. Despite these moral failures, Ahab remained a skilled political leader. He formed a coalition of regional kings to resist the growing power of Ben-Hadad of Damascus, and later faced the rising threat of Assyria at the Battle of Karkar. Israel's participation in the coalition against the Assyrians, as recorded in Assyrian inscriptions, illustrates the kingdom's significant military stature during Ahab's reign. However, Ahab's military campaigns also brought his death. In a later battle against the Arameans at Ramoth-Gilead, he disguised himself to avoid being targeted. Yet a random arrow struck him, and he died in his chariot. His body was returned to Samaria, where dogs licked his blood, fulfilling part of Elijah's earlier prophecy. Ahab was succeeded by his sons, but the dynasty would not last much longer. The religious policies of Ahab and Jezebel, combined with the legacy of corruption and injustice, fueled internal dissent. While the Omride dynasty had achieved political success and economic growth, its disregard for prophetic counsel and covenantal faithfulness left it vulnerable to revolt and divine judgment, at least as interpreted by later biblical authors. As the kingdom of Israel advanced under the Omride dynasty, so too did the influence of a new kind of leadership: the prophets. These men were not officials in the royal court or administrators in the cities. They were outspoken, independent, and deeply committed to the covenantal ideals of justice, righteousness, and exclusive worship of Yahweh. In times of idolatry, corruption, and political oppression, they became the voice of protest and the conscience of the nation. The prophetic movement, already growing under earlier figures like Ahijah, reached powerful new heights in the ministries of Elijah and his successor, Elisha. Elijah's appearance in the biblical narrative is sudden and dramatic. He emerged during the reign of King Ahab as the monarch, along with his queen Jezebel, promoted the worship of Baal and undermined traditional Yahweh-centered worship. Elijah, whose name means "My God is Yahweh," became the most visible opponent of these policies. Without ceremony or introduction, he declared to the king that there would be no dew or rain in Israel except at his word. This drought, lasting several years, struck at the heart of Baal's supposed control over fertility and rain, exposing the futility of idol worship. During the drought, Elijah lived in seclusion, first by a brook where ravens fed him, and then in the home of a widow in Zarephath, a Phoenician town near Sidon. There, he performed miracles of provision and even raised the widow's son from death, demonstrating divine power outside of Israelite territory. These stories highlighted a key theme in the Elijah narrative. Yahweh's authority was not limited by geography or politics. The true God could act anywhere and through anyone. Elijah's most defining moment came in the confrontation on Mount Carmel. He challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest before the people of Israel. Each side would prepare a sacrifice and call upon their God to send fire. The prophets of Baal danced and cried out for hours, but nothing happened. Elijah then repaired an old altar to Yahweh, drenched the sacrifice with water, and prayed. Fire fell from heaven, consuming the offering. The people fell on their faces, declaring, "Yahweh, He is God." Elijah then ordered the execution of the false prophets, a harsh but symbolic act aimed at purging Baal worship from the land. Despite this public triumph, Elijah's struggle was far from over. Jezebel, enraged by the loss of her prophets, vowed to kill him. Elijah fled into the wilderness, discouraged and afraid. There he experienced a profound spiritual moment on Mount Horeb, where he encountered God not in wind, earthquake, or fire, but in a gentle whisper. This encounter redefined Elijah's mission. God instructed him to anoint new leaders in both Israel and Aram, and to choose a successor, Elisha. Elisha's ministry, while continuing Elijah's prophetic mission, had a distinct character. Whereas Elijah often acted alone and dramatically, Elisha maintained a larger network of disciples, sometimes referred to as the sons of the prophets. He was known for performing miracles, including healing the sick, purifying poisoned water, multiplying food for the poor, and even raising the dead. His work often took him to rural areas, where he interacted directly with common people. In this way, Elisha's ministry emphasized the accessibility and compassion of Yahweh's power. One of the most politically significant episodes in Elisha's career occurred during the reign of King Jehoram, Ahab's son. The king of Aram waged war against Israel, and Elisha repeatedly warned the Israelite king of Aramean ambushes, demonstrating divine insight. At one point, the Arameans surrounded the city of Dothan, where Elisha was staying, intending to capture him. Elisha prayed, and his servant was granted a vision of heavenly chariots surrounding them, a reminder that God's unseen power was greater than any military threat. Elisha also played a key role in the rise of a new king, Jehu. As discontent with Ahab's house grew, especially due to Jezebel's enduring influence, Elisha sent a young prophet to anoint Jehu, a military commander, as the next king of Israel. This moment marked a turning point in Israelite politics. Jehu's revolt was swift and bloody. He assassinated King Jehoram, had Jezebel thrown from a window and trampled by horses, and ordered the massacre of Ahab's remaining family and allies. Jehu even orchestrated the killing of Baal worshippers and destroyed the temple of Baal in Samaria. These actions, though violent, were portrayed in biblical texts as divine judgment against Ahab's house and the idolatry it had promoted. Yet Jehu's reign, while marked by religious reform, failed to fully align with prophetic ideals. Though he removed Baal worship, he maintained the golden calves at Bethel and Dan. The prophet's relationship with kings remained complex. They could install them, confront them, and even bring divine judgment upon them. But few kings truly embraced the prophetic vision of justice, mercy, and exclusive loyalty to Yahweh. The legacy of Elijah and Elisha extended beyond their lifetimes. Their ministries demonstrated that spiritual authority did not reside in temples, palaces, or priestly lineage, but in obedience to God and service to the people. Their miracles and confrontations made them folk heroes, remembered for centuries as defenders of the faith in a time of crisis. Elijah, in particular, left a deep imprint on the religious imagination of Israel. He did not die in the ordinary sense, but was taken up into heaven in a whirlwind, accompanied by a chariot of fire. This dramatic departure inspired future expectations of his return. By later Jewish tradition, Elijah would come again to prepare the way for the Messiah. His presence would be invoked at Passover meals and remembered in times of hope and longing. Elisha's final acts continued the pattern of miraculous intervention. Even after his death, a man's body thrown into Elisha's tomb was revived upon touching his bones, signaling that the prophet's power extended beyond the grave. Yet the kingdom he served was becoming increasingly unstable. Though the Omride dynasty had ended, the political turmoil and religious confusion remained. As the 9th century BCE gave way to the 8th, a new force began to rise in the northeast, one that would ultimately reshape the political map of the ancient Near East and seal the fate of the northern kingdom of Israel. That power was Assyria, a vast and militarily advanced empire based along the upper Tigris River. While the Kingdom of Israel had enjoyed periods of relative independence, wealth, and territorial control during the Omride and Jehu dynasties, its geographical position placed it directly in the path of Assyrian expansion. The stage was now set for a prolonged and ultimately devastating encounter. The Assyrian Empire had long been a regional power, but its resurgence began in earnest under kings such as Adad-nirari III and Tiglath-Pileser III. These rulers initiated aggressive campaigns of conquest, enforced tributary relationships with neighboring states, and developed a sophisticated administrative system that allowed the empire to manage vast territories. The Assyrians employed advanced siege technology, professional standing armies, and a policy of mass deportation that made resistance both dangerous and costly. For smaller kingdoms like Israel, navigating Assyrian aggression required a combination of diplomacy, tribute, and at times, open rebellion. This was a dangerous balancing act. To submit meant heavy taxation, loss of autonomy, and possible humiliation. To resist meant facing the full might of a war machine designed to crush dissent. By the time Tiglath-Pileser III ascended the throne of Assyria, Israel was already beginning to fracture internally. After the death of Jeroboam II, a long-reigning and militarily successful king, the northern kingdom entered a period of instability marked by short reigns, assassinations, and rapid leadership changes. Jeroboam II had expanded Israel's territory and brought prosperity, but he also left behind a society deeply divided by class inequality and spiritual corruption, as condemned by prophets such as Amos and Hosea. Following Jeroboam II's death, his son Zechariah ruled only a few months before being assassinated by Shallum, who was in turn murdered shortly thereafter by Menahem. Menahem managed to hold the throne for about a decade, but only by submitting to Assyria. He paid a large tribute to Tiglath-Pileser III, essentially buying Assyrian support for his continued rule. The tribute was drawn from the wealth of the people, deepening domestic discontent and reinforcing the image of a compromised monarchy. Menahem's son Pekka succeeded him but was quickly overthrown by Pekka, a military officer who opposed the policy of appeasement toward Assyria. Pekka aligned with Rezin, the king of Aram Damascus, and together they formed an anti-Assyrian alliance. Their goal was to create a regional bloc capable of resisting Assyrian dominance. To solidify this alliance, they pressured Judah to join. When King Ahaz of Judah refused, they launched an invasion aimed at deposing him. This move backfired. Instead of submitting to the alliance, Ahaz appealed to Tiglath-Pileser III for help. The Assyrian king responded by launching a massive campaign into the Levant. He attacked Damascus, annexed much of Aram, and invaded northern Israel. Major cities such as Hazor, Megiddo, and Gilead fell. Portions of Israel's population were deported, and the northern territories were reorganized into Assyrian provinces. Pekka was assassinated during this crisis, likely by a pro-Assyrian faction, and Hosea was installed as a puppet king. Hosea's rule marked the beginning of the end for the northern kingdom. Though technically still a kingdom, Israel had lost much of its autonomy. Hosea paid tribute to the Assyrians and ruled under their oversight. However, as Assyrian attention shifted temporarily elsewhere, Hosea attempted to assert independence by forming an alliance with Egypt, a traditional rival of Assyria and occasional supporter of anti-Assyrian coalitions. This decision proved fatal. When Assyria discovered Hosea's rebellion, the new king Shalmaneser V responded with force. He launched a campaign against Israel, besieging its capital, Samaria. The siege lasted for several years and tested the endurance of both the city and its inhabitants. While Shalmaneser V died during the siege, his successor Sargon II completed the conquest. In the year 722 BCE, Samaria fell. The northern kingdom of Israel was no more. Thousands were deported to regions within the Assyrian Empire, including Halah, Gozan, and the cities of the Medes. Assyrian records proudly recorded the conquest, listing the number of captives and the territories absorbed into the empire. The people left behind in the land were merged with other populations relocated from elsewhere in the empire, beginning a complex process of cultural mixing and religious transformation. The fall of Israel was not only a military and political catastrophe, it was also a theological crisis. For centuries, the Israelites had believed themselves to be God's chosen people, protected by a covenant stretching back to the patriarchs and reaffirmed at Sinai. How, then, could they have suffered such a defeat? What did it mean that their kingdom had collapsed and their people had been scattered? Prophets like Hosea had long warned that the kingdom's injustice, idolatry, and failure to uphold the covenant would lead to judgment. Hosea portrayed Israel as an unfaithful spouse, chasing after foreign gods and betraying its divine partner. He called for repentance, love, and a return to faithfulness. But his words went unheeded. The Assyrian conquest, in the eyes of many, became a fulfillment of those prophetic warnings. Amos, another prophet, active during the time of Jeroboam II, had similarly denounced social inequality and religious hypocrisy. He declared that ritual offerings were meaningless if accompanied by injustice and exploitation. "Let justice roll down like waters," he cried, "and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." His warnings, too, had fallen on deaf ears. The rise of Assyria revealed the fragility of Israel's internal structures. Though the kingdom had achieved moments of wealth and influence, it lacked the political coherence and spiritual resilience to withstand sustained external pressure. Dynastic instability, reliance on foreign alliances, and moral decay left it vulnerable to imperial domination. Meanwhile, Judah in the south observed the fate of its northern neighbor with a mixture of fear and reflection. Though smaller and less powerful, Judah still retained its capital in Jerusalem and the temple that had served as a national and religious center. In the wake of Israel's fall, Judah would become the primary carrier of Israelite identity and memory. The prophetic traditions that had flourished in the north found new expression in the south, where voices like Isaiah and Micah would rise to interpret the crisis and call for renewed faith. As the shadow of Assyria loomed larger over the Levant, the northern kingdom of Israel found itself unraveling from within. While external forces posed an existential threat, the final unraveling of the kingdom was accelerated by a breakdown in internal leadership. The long-standing Jehu dynasty, which had ruled for nearly a century, collapsed, ushering in a period of political chaos. Assassinations, short-lived reigns, and shifting alliances left the kingdom fragile and exposed. The house of Jehu, once established by divine sanction and military might, became the final dynastic era of Israel before its irreversible fall. The dynasty began with Jehu, a military commander who seized power through a bloody coup sanctioned by the prophet Elisha. Jehu had brought an end to the Omride dynasty, executing King Jehoram and ordering the death of Jezebel, the queen mother. He wiped out the descendants of Ahab and purged Baal worship from the land, earning a measure of prophetic approval. For his zeal, Yahweh promised that his descendants would rule Israel to the 4th generation. That promise was fulfilled in a strict and tragic sense. Jehu's dynasty extended through 4 kings: Jehoahaz, Jehoash, Jeroboam II, and Zechariah, but ended with a brutal termination. After a brief period of strength under Jeroboam II, the dynasty fell victim to the same forces of instability and decline that were affecting the entire kingdom. Jeroboam II ruled for several decades, during which time Israel experienced military success and economic expansion. He recovered lost territories, reasserted control over trade routes, and oversaw a time of relative prosperity. However, this golden era masked deep internal problems. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of elites, social injustice was rampant, and religious syncretism remained widespread. The prophet Amos, active during Jeroboam's reign, denounced the complacency of the rich and the exploitation of the poor, warning that judgment was inevitable. When Jeroboam II died, the dynasty entered a steep decline. His son Zechariah ascended the throne but reigned for only a few months before being assassinated by Shallum, a former official. This marked the end of the house of Jehu and the beginning of rapid dynastic turnover. Shallum himself ruled for barely a month before being killed by Menahem, another military figure. Menahem managed to maintain the throne for about a decade, but his rule came at the cost of independence. During his reign, Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria invaded the region. To secure his position and avoid direct conquest, Menahem paid a heavy tribute to Assyria. This tribute was extracted from the wealth of the people, deepening resentment and weakening the king's domestic legitimacy. Menahem's reign highlighted the impossible choices faced by Israelite kings in this era: submit to Assyria and be seen as a puppet, or resist and risk annihilation. Menahem was succeeded by his son Pekahiah, but like his predecessors, Pekahiah's rule was short and ended in assassination. He was overthrown by Pekka, a captain in the army who opposed the pro-Assyrian policies of the previous administration. Pekka aligned himself with Rezin of Aram Damascus in an anti-Assyrian coalition and tried to force the kingdom of Judah to join. When Judah's king Ahaz refused, the two allies invaded Judah in what became known as the Syro-Ephraimite War. Instead of capitulating, Ahaz appealed directly to Assyria for help. Tiglath-Pileser III responded with overwhelming force, invading Israel and Aram, capturing key northern territories and deporting segments of the population. Cities like Hazor, Gilead, and Galilee were annexed into the Assyrian Empire. Pekka, having led Israel into disaster, was assassinated by Hosea, likely with Assyrian approval. Hosea became the last king of Israel. His reign began as a vassal under Assyrian rule. He paid tribute to Shalmaneser V, maintaining a fragile peace. But Hosea, like others before him, sought to escape the heavy burden of foreign domination. He turned to Egypt, hoping that Pharaoh So would offer support in a rebellion against Assyria. This alliance proved ill-fated. Egypt, weakened and fragmented, failed to intervene in time. When Assyria learned of Hosea's betrayal, Shalmaneser V marched against Israel. Hosea was captured and imprisoned. The Assyrians besieged Samaria, Israel's capital, a siege that lasted for about 3 years. During that time, the kingdom's resources were exhausted, and its resistance slowly broke down. When the city finally fell, either under Shalmaneser or his successor, Sargon II, the northern kingdom ceased to exist as an independent state. The Assyrians deported large segments of the population to distant regions of the empire, including Hala, Gozan on the Habur River, and cities of the Medes. In their place, foreign peoples were settled in Israelite territory, creating a new and mixed population with different religious practices. This event marked more than the end of a political entity. It was a spiritual and cultural crisis. The Israelites had long believed that their covenant with Yahweh offered them protection and identity. Prophets, such as Hosea, had warned of judgment, using the metaphor of a broken marriage to describe Israel's unfaithfulness. The fall of Samaria fulfilled these warnings in devastating fashion. The biblical narrative attributes the fall not only to Assyrian strength but to Israel's failure to uphold the covenant. The kings of Israel, especially after the reign of Jeroboam II, are portrayed as corrupt, idolatrous, and indifferent to justice. The collapse of the Jehu dynasty, followed by the rise and fall of transient rulers, underscored the instability and spiritual decline of the kingdom. Prophets did not simply condemn, they also mourned. Hosea, for example, spoke of Israel as a beloved child, grieved over by a compassionate yet offended father. He envisioned a future return and restoration, even in the midst of judgment. This prophetic hope would become essential in preserving the spiritual identity of the people after their kingdom was gone. By the late 8th century BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel stood on the brink of collapse. Decades of political instability, dynastic assassinations, and external pressures had left the state fragmented and weak. Though earlier generations had known military success and economic prosperity, those days were now a distant memory. With the rise of the Assyrian Empire under rulers like Tiglath-Pileser III and Shalmaneser V, Israel's independence became increasingly untenable. The final act of the kingdom's history would unfold in its capital city, Samaria. The last king of Israel, Hosea, came to power during a period of Assyrian dominance in the region. After assassinating his predecessor, Pekka, Hosea was placed on the throne with the approval of Assyria. In effect, Israel became a vassal state. Hosea was expected to pay annual tribute to the Assyrian king as a sign of submission. At first he complied, maintaining a precarious peace that preserved a degree of autonomy, but this arrangement was deeply unpopular among many in Israel. Tribute to Assyria meant draining resources from the population and symbolized humiliation before a foreign oppressor. Perhaps hoping to regain full independence, Hosea reached out to Egypt, seeking support for a rebellion against Assyrian control. Egypt had long positioned itself as a regional rival to Assyria and occasionally offered symbolic or diplomatic support to smaller states resisting Assyrian pressure. However, Egypt at this time was politically fragmented and militarily weak. Its ability to provide tangible assistance was limited. When Hosea stopped paying tribute and aligned himself with Egypt, Shalmaneser V interpreted the move as open rebellion. The response was swift and severe. Assyrian forces marched into Israel and laid siege to Samaria, the kingdom's capital. The siege of Samaria lasted for approximately 3 years. Though fortified and strategically positioned, the city eventually succumbed to starvation, disease, and military pressure. Shalmaneser V died during the siege, but his successor, Sargon II, completed the conquest and claimed the victory. According to Sargon's inscriptions, over 27,000 Israelites were deported from the region and resettled in distant parts of the Assyrian Empire, including Hala, Gozan, and the cities of the Medes. This policy of mass deportation was a hallmark of Assyrian imperial strategy. The goal was not simply to punish, but to prevent rebellion by displacing populations, mixing ethnic groups, and breaking local identities. In place of the deported Israelites, the Assyrians imported people from other conquered lands. These new settlers brought with them their own languages, cultures, and religious practices, which they mixed with local traditions. The fall of Samaria marked the end of the northern kingdom of Israel as a political entity. The 10 tribes that made up the kingdom were scattered and absorbed into the wider Assyrian world. While some remnants may have remained in the land, the core population was gone. The region formerly known as Israel became an Assyrian province, governed by imperial officials and stripped of its national institutions. In Judah, the southern kingdom, the fall of Samaria was a moment of both vindication and deep anxiety. For years, prophets in Judah had warned of judgment upon the northern kingdom for its idolatry and failure to follow the covenant. Now, those warnings had come to pass. The theological interpretation of the event became clear in the writings of historians and prophets. Israel had fallen because it had turned away from Yahweh. The biblical account in the second book of Kings offers a detailed theological explanation. It describes how the people of Israel adopted the customs of the nations, built high places in every town, worshipped idols, and rejected the commandments of God. Prophets had been sent to call the people back, but they were ignored or persecuted. In response, God allowed the Assyrians to remove them from the land. While this interpretation highlights the spiritual dimensions of the collapse, it also reflects the broader concerns of Judahite scribes writing in the aftermath. They saw in Israel's downfall a warning to their own kingdom, a reminder that covenantal disobedience could bring national ruin. The history of Israel became a theological mirror for Judah, inviting reflection, repentance, and reform. The memory of the 10 northern tribes, often referred to as the lost tribes of Israel, became a subject of fascination and speculation in later centuries. Though many of the deported Israelites likely assimilated into the populations where they were resettled, their legacy endured in religious tradition. Some later Jewish and even Christian texts imagined their return in a future time of restoration, when all 12 tribes would be reunited. Meanwhile, in the land of Israel, the arrival of foreign settlers gave rise to a new population with mixed ancestry and mixed religious practices. These people would eventually come to be known as Samaritans. They claimed descent from the Israelites who had remained in the land and developed their own version of Yahweh worship, centered not in Jerusalem but on Mount Gerizim. This group would play a significant role in later biblical history, especially during the post-exilic and New Testament periods, but their origins can be traced to the aftermath of the Assyrian conquest. From a geopolitical perspective, the fall of Samaria altered the balance of power in the southern Levant. With Israel gone, Judah stood alone as the last Hebrew kingdom. Though it had also faced Assyrian pressure, it had survived, in part through political accommodation and, at times, through effective leadership. But the long-term lesson of Israel's fate loomed large. The prophets of Judah, figures like Isaiah and Micah, would continue to warn that the sins of Israel were being repeated in the south. In archaeological terms, the fall of Samaria is well attested. Assyrian records, including royal inscriptions and administrative documents, confirm the details of the conquest and the resettlement policies that followed. Excavations at Samaria reveal destruction layers consistent with a military campaign. Together, these sources provide a clear picture of the end of the northern kingdom. When the kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrian Empire in the late 8th century BCE, it was not only the destruction of a political state but the beginning of one of the most enduring mysteries in biblical and world history, the fate of the so-called lost tribes of Israel. The deportation of tens of thousands of Israelites to distant lands scattered them across the Assyrian imperial landscape, cutting them off from their homeland, temple, and institutions. Over time, the memory of these tribes transformed into a rich body of tradition, speculation, and longing that would echo through Jewish, Christian, and even Islamic thought. The biblical account, primarily found in the second book of Kings, states that after the fall of Samaria, the king of Assyria resettled the people of Israel in cities throughout Assyria, including Hala, Gozan on the Habor River, and the towns of the Medes. In their place, Assyrian authorities brought in populations from other conquered lands, such as Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim. These resettled peoples came to inhabit the former Israelite territory and formed what would later become known as the Samaritan community. The Assyrian strategy of mass deportation was not a new invention, but a refined tool of imperial control. By removing rebellious populations from their native lands and dispersing them across different regions, the Assyrians minimized the risk of future uprisings. At the same time, this policy diluted ethnic and cultural identities, integrating subject peoples into the broader imperial structure. While some Israelites may have adapted and flourished in their new environments, many were absorbed into the local cultures, and over generations, their distinct identity gradually disappeared. The biblical narrative does not provide further historical updates about the deported tribes. This silence created space for theological and imaginative interpretations. By the post-exilic period, especially among the communities in Judah and later among Second Temple Jewish writers, the fate of the northern tribes became a question of religious significance and national memory. The term "lost tribes of Israel" refers primarily to the 10 northern tribes traditionally believed to have been exiled: Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Ephraim, and Manasseh. Only Judah and Benjamin, along with some Levites, remained in the southern kingdom, and thus continued to form the basis of the post-exilic Jewish community. The others had seemingly vanished from history, yet this disappearance did not mean total forgetfulness. The concept of a future reunion between the North and the South became a powerful theme in prophetic literature. Prophets such as Ezekiel, writing during the Babylonian exile of Judah more than a century after the fall of Samaria, envisioned a day when the divided kingdoms would once again be united. In one of Ezekiel's symbolic acts, he was instructed to take 2 sticks, one representing Judah and one representing Ephraim, and join them together as a sign of the future restoration of all Israel. Similarly, in the book of Hosea, the prophet, though deeply critical of Israel's unfaithfulness, speaks of a future reconciliation. "The people of Judah and the people of Israel will be gathered together," he says, "and they will appoint one leader and come up out of the land." These and other texts kept alive the hope that the tribes were not gone forever but would one day return. By the time of the Second Temple period, Particularly in the centuries leading up to and following the Common Era, Jewish thinkers and communities across the world continued to speculate about the lost tribes. The book of 2nd Esdras, an apocalyptic text preserved in some Christian Bibles, contains a narrative in which the lost tribes are said to have journeyed to a distant, unknown land called Arsareth, where they would remain until the end times. This idea that the tribes had migrated beyond the bounds of the known world took deep root and helped shape later legends. In the rabbinic tradition, there was debate over whether the 10 tribes would ever return. Some rabbis believed they had been permanently lost, while others taught that they would be restored in the Messianic age. The ambiguity in these teachings only added to the allure and mystery surrounding their fate. Throughout the medieval and early modern periods, Jewish and Christian travelers, missionaries, and explorers frequently claimed to have discovered descendants of the lost tribes in distant lands. From Ethiopia to India, from Central Asia to the Americas, various groups were identified or self-identified as part of the scattered Israelites. In the highlands of Ethiopia, the Beta Israel community, known historically as Ethiopian Jews, maintained distinct religious traditions and claimed descent from the tribe of Dan. Though their exact origins remain debated, their centuries-old existence and faith practices drew significant attention, particularly in the modern period. In the 20th century, many Beta Israel were brought to Israel in large-scale operations, further affirming their connection to Jewish heritage. In India, the Bnei Menashe, a community from the northeastern regions of Manipur and Mizoram, claimed descent from the tribe of Manasseh. Their traditions included rituals reminiscent of biblical practices, and in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, they too sought and gained recognition from religious authorities in Israel, with many immigrating to the modern state. Claims of descent from the lost tribes have also emerged in Central Asia among the Pashtun tribes of Afghanistan and Pakistan, some of whom maintain oral traditions linking them to ancient Israel. In China, a group known as the Kaifeng Jews, who settled centuries earlier, also preserved Jewish customs. Though many of these connections remain speculative or symbolic rather than genealogically verifiable, they reflect a deep and ongoing fascination with the idea of Israel scattered but not forgotten. In Christian tradition, especially in the context of British Israelism and other theological movements, the concept of the lost tribes was reinterpreted to suggest that European peoples, particularly those of the British Isles, were descendants of ancient Israelites. These claims, though widely discredited by modern scholarship, shaped religious and imperial ideologies in the 19th century. Beyond historical speculation, the idea of the lost tribes carried profound theological meaning. For many Jewish communities, it represented both a tragedy and a hope, a symbol of disobedience and divine judgment, but also a future reunion and redemption. The unity of all Israel, including both Judah and the lost tribes, became a central vision in messianic expectations. With the fall of Samaria and the dissolution of the northern kingdom of Israel in the late 8th century BCE, Judah remained the last standing Hebrew kingdom. Though smaller in territory and population, Judah now bore the burden of continuity. It had inherited not only the Davidic monarchy and the temple in Jerusalem, but also the cultural and theological legacy of its lost northern counterpart. The survival of Judah during this precarious time was neither inevitable nor easy. Surrounded by aggressive empires and absorbing the shock of regional collapse, Judah was forced to adapt politically, spiritually, and socially in order to preserve its identity. In the immediate aftermath of Israel's destruction, Judah was ruled by King Hezekiah, one of the most significant monarchs in its history. Hezekiah ascended the throne not long after the Assyrian conquest of Samaria and faced a radically altered geopolitical landscape. The north was now an Assyrian province, and Assyrian power extended throughout the Levant. Judah itself had previously paid tribute to Assyria under Hezekiah's father, King Ahaz, who had sought protection from Assyrian forces during the Syro-Ephraimite crisis. Unlike his father, Hezekiah pursued a policy of religious reform and partial political independence. Influenced by prophetic voices such as Isaiah, He initiated a series of purges against what were considered foreign or idolatrous religious practices within Judah. High places were torn down, cultic objects removed, and the temple in Jerusalem was purified and restored to central importance. One of Hezekiah's most symbolic acts was the destruction of the bronze serpent, called Nehushtan, which had reportedly been preserved from the time of Moses, but had become an object of veneration. These reforms were not merely spiritual gestures, they were declarations of national identity. In the wake of Israel's destruction and assimilation, Hezekiah's actions signaled that Judah would not follow the same path. The centralized worship of Yahweh in Jerusalem would serve as both a religious and political unifier. Furthermore, refugees from the north, including Levites, priests, and common people, streamed into Judah, bringing with them traditions, stories, and prophetic perspectives that enriched Jerusalem's cultural life, but also deepened the urgency for reform and national renewal. Hezekiah's reign reached a critical moment when he chose to resist Assyrian dominance. At some point, likely emboldened by regional unrest and the temporary weakness of Assyria, he joined a coalition of states seeking independence. The response from Assyria was swift and brutal. Under the command of King Sennacherib, Assyrian forces swept through Judah, capturing fortified cities and laying siege to Jerusalem itself. The Assyrian campaign is one of the best documented events in the ancient Near East. Both biblical texts and Assyrian inscriptions, such as the famous Taylor Prism, recount the confrontation. According to Sennacherib, he captured 46 fortified cities of Judah and trapped Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. The biblical narrative adds that Hezekiah, in desperation, sent tribute to Sennacherib, silver, gold, and treasures from the temple. Yet, remarkably, Jerusalem was not destroyed. The reasons for this remain debated. Some scholars suggest that the Assyrian army suffered from disease or logistical issues. Others propose that Hezekiah's tribute was accepted as sufficient submission. The biblical account describes a divine intervention. An angel of the Lord struck down a great number of Assyrian soldiers in the night, causing Sennacherib to withdraw. Regardless of the precise cause, Jerusalem's survival became a powerful symbol of Yahweh's protection and Judah's chosenness. This deliverance reinforced the authority of the Jerusalem priesthood, the prophetic establishment, and the Davidic monarchy. It also furthered the development of theological ideas that would endure through exile and beyond. The centrality of Jerusalem, the power of faith in the face of imperial might, and the belief in a God who intervenes in history. After Hezekiah, Judah entered a complex period under his son Manasseh. In stark contrast to his father, Manasseh reversed the religious reforms and embraced Assyrian political and religious influence. He is portrayed in the biblical narrative as one of the most idolatrous kings in Judah's history. He introduced altars to foreign gods within the temple itself, practiced child sacrifice, and encouraged sorcery and divination. Prophets declared that because of Manasseh's sins, Judah's fate would ultimately mirror that of Israel. Despite his theological failures, Manasseh's reign was politically stable and long, lasting more than half a century. His cooperation with Assyria secured Judah's survival during a time when resistance would have been disastrous. Some historians argue that his policies, however offensive to religious reformers, were pragmatically necessary to maintain autonomy under Assyrian hegemony. Nonetheless, the spiritual damage described by later writers left a lasting impression, making Manasseh a symbol of Judah's moral decline. Manasseh was succeeded by his son Amon, who continued in his father's path but reigned only briefly before being assassinated. His young son Josiah then took the throne and would go on to become one of Judah's most celebrated kings. Josiah's reign represents a return to the reformist agenda of Hezekiah, but with greater intensity and broader support. During Josiah's rule, a remarkable event occurred, the discovery of a book of the law during temple renovations. Many scholars believe this text was an early form of what would become the Book of Deuteronomy. Its rediscovery prompted a national religious revival. Josiah renewed the covenant with Yahweh, centralized worship in Jerusalem, and abolished local shrines and high places throughout the land. The Passover was celebrated with unprecedented devotion, and prophetic voices praised his zeal. Josiah's reforms were not merely symbolic. They reshaped Judah's identity at a foundational level. By anchoring national life around covenantal obedience, temple worship, and legal texts, Judah began to develop institutions and ideologies that would sustain it even in exile. Josiah's reign was a high point of spiritual and national renewal, though tragically cut short. The fall of the Kingdom of Israel in the late 8th century BCE did not mark the end of its influence. Though its capital was destroyed, its tribes scattered, and its royal lines extinguished, the legacy of the Northern Kingdom lived on, shaping religious thought, national memory, and cultural identity in the ancient Near East and beyond. Its story, one of triumph and tragedy, faith and failure, became a foundational narrative for generations that followed. When scholars and theologians reflect on the Kingdom of Israel, they are often struck by the contrast between its historical brevity and its enduring presence in the biblical imagination. From the division of the united monarchy after Solomon to its destruction by the Assyrians, Israel existed as an independent kingdom for just over 2 centuries. Yet, in that relatively short time, it contributed profoundly to the religious and literary development of the Israelite people and to the shaping of ancient Hebrew thought. One of the most lasting contributions of the Kingdom of Israel was the development and preservation of prophetic traditions. While prophecy certainly existed in Judah, it was in Israel that many of the earliest and most influential prophetic voices arose. Elijah and Elisha stood boldly in opposition to royal power, embodying the belief that political authority must remain accountable to divine law. Later prophets such as Amos and Hosea emerged from the northern kingdom, speaking out against injustice, idolatry, and the hypocrisy of empty ritual. These prophets not only critiqued the kings and people of their time, but also introduced theological themes that would echo across the centuries: the demand for social justice, the call to covenantal loyalty, and the vision of a restored, unified Israel. Amos's declaration that God despised sacrifices made without righteousness, or Hosea's plea for steadfast love instead of mere ritual, helped shape the moral framework of later biblical literature. These were not abstract religious ideas. They were forged in the crucible of political collapse, spiritual crisis, and cultural upheaval. Even after the kingdom itself had vanished, the writings and stories from Israel shaped how later generations understood the past and envisioned the future. The compilers of the Hebrew Bible, many of whom lived in Judah during or after the Babylonian exile, included northern prophetic texts and historical records. These texts were not merely preserved as historical artifacts. They were interpreted, edited, and woven into a larger narrative that sought to explain the rise and fall of kingdoms in theological terms. From this perspective, the Kingdom of Israel became a cautionary tale. Its downfall was not just a geopolitical failure, but a spiritual one. The biblical historians emphasized the role of unfaithful kings, the worship of false gods, and the rejection of prophetic warnings. Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom, was consistently condemned for establishing rival sanctuaries at Bethel and Dan. Later monarchs were judged by whether they followed in the ways of Jeroboam or deviated from the covenantal standards set at Sinai. Yet the story of Israel was not told only as a story of judgment. It was also remembered with a sense of loss, even longing. The northern tribes were not erased from memory. They were mourned, prayed for, and hoped to be restored. This complex legacy, blending critique with compassion, warning with promise, gave Israel a permanent place in the theological and emotional landscape of the Hebrew people. Culturally, the northern kingdom contributed to the shaping of Israelite identity through its language, literature, and regional practices. Many of the early biblical stories and traditions likely had northern origins. especially those associated with the patriarchs, the Exodus, and the tribal period. These traditions were preserved not just in written texts, but also in oral storytelling, liturgy, and collective memory. The city of Samaria, once the proud capital of Israel, continued to exist under Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, and later Hellenistic rule. It became the center of a mixed population that developed into the Samaritan community, which maintained its own version of the Pentateuch and a distinct form of Yahweh worship centered on Mount Gerizim. Though viewed with suspicion and often hostility by Jews in the post-exilic period, the Samaritans represented a living thread of the northern kingdom's legacy, preserving customs and beliefs rooted in the ancient Israelite past. The loss of the 10 northern tribes also had a profound impact on Jewish theology and eschatology. Over time, the idea of the lost tribes became a powerful symbol of both exile and hope. In the books of Ezekiel and Jeremiah, prophets looked forward to a day when the divided kingdoms would be reunited, when the exiled tribes would return, and when a new covenant would be written on the hearts of the people. This hope was not merely nostalgic, it was transformative. The memory of Israel's fall became a moral compass for Judah and later for the Jewish diaspora. It offered both a reason to repent and a reason to believe that restoration was possible. The vision of a reunited Israel under a new Davidic king shaped messianic expectations and helped sustain Jewish identity during centuries of exile and oppression. In the wider world, the kingdom of Israel also left an imprint on the imagination of others. In Christian tradition, the parable of the Good Samaritan and Jesus' interactions with the Samaritan woman at the well reflected ongoing tensions and connections with the northern heritage. In Islam, prophets such as Elijah and Elisha are recognized, and the ancient Israelites are part of the broader narrative of prophetic history. Modern archaeology has added new dimensions to our understanding of Israel's legacy. Excavations at sites like Samaria, Megiddo, Hazor, and Dan have revealed fortifications, administrative buildings, inscriptions, and artifacts that attest to a sophisticated and organized state. These findings confirm the biblical account of Israel as a powerful kingdom engaged in international politics, trade, and warfare. Inscriptions from neighboring civilizations, especially the Assyrians, also corroborate the existence and fate of Israelite kings. Records from kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser V, and Sargon II describe campaigns against Israel, the collection of tribute, and the deportation of populations. These external sources help us understand the geopolitical pressures that shaped Israel's decisions and ultimately led to its destruction. And yet, history is not only what can be excavated or recorded, it is also what is remembered, interpreted, and carried forward. The kingdom of Israel, though fallen, became part of a larger story that transcended its borders and its years. Its prophets spoke words that still resonate. Its people, though scattered, were never entirely forgotten. Its fall became a lesson, its hope a promise. Today, the story of the Kingdom of Israel invites reflection not only on ancient politics or theology, but on enduring human themes: leadership and responsibility, faith and identity, division and reconciliation. It reminds us that history is not only a record of what happened, but also a conversation about what matters. Thus, the kingdom that once stood in the hills of Samaria, that built its own temples, fought its own battles, and dreamed its own dreams, continues to speak. Its voice is heard in sacred texts, in archaeological ruins, in the echoes of prophets, and in the longing for a world where justice, faithfulness, and unity prevail. This concludes the journey through the entire story of the Kingdom of Israel, its rise, its reign, its ruin, and its remembrance. Though the kingdom is gone, its story endures. Story endures.